There are moments in television that happen so quietly, most people don't notice them at all. February 12th, 1974. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Tuesday night. Dean Martin was scheduled to appear at 11:47 p.m., right after the second commercial break. Johnny had interviewed Dean 17 times before. He knew exactly what to expect: the loose swagger, the half-empty glass prop, the rehearsed stumbles that made America laugh. Dean Martin was a performance, a brilliant, polished, perfectly calibrated performance. But that night, something changed. Johnny didn't see it at first. Nobody did. The show opened as it always did. Ed McMahon's booming voice, the curtain, the applause. Johnny delivered his monologue with the precision of a man who had done this 4,000 times. The jokes landed. The audience laughed. Everything was exactly as it should be. Backstage, Dean Martin sat alone in his dressing room. He wasn't drinking. That was the first unusual thing. The stage manager noticed it when he knocked to give the 10-minute warning. Dean was just sitting there, staring at his hands. No cigarette, no glass, no jokes with the makeup artist or the sound technician. Just silence. "Mr. Martin?" Dean looked up. His face was tired in a way that makeup couldn't hide. "Yeah," he said. "I know." The stage manager hesitated. In all the years Dean had been coming to The Tonight Show, he'd never seen him like this. Dean Martin was supposed to be the easiest guest in show business. Always on, always ready, always performing. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. Something absent. "You okay, Mr. Martin?" Dean smiled. It was the smile he'd given 10,000 audiences, but this time it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Never better, pal." The stage manager left. Dean sat there for another 8 minutes, listening to the muffled sound of Johnny's voice through the wall, the rhythm of laughter and applause. He'd been doing this for 30 years. Longer, if you counted the nightclubs, the small rooms in Cleveland and Chicago where he and Jerry Lewis used to kill 5 shows a night. He knew how this worked. You walk out, you smile, you tell the stories people want to hear, you make them laugh, you leave. Simple, but tonight felt different. At 11:46 p.m., Dean stood up. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, a perfect Windsor knot, the way his father had taught him when he was 16. He checked his cufflinks. He ran a hand through his hair. Everything in place. Everything perfect. And then he walked toward the stage. Johnny was wrapping up a bit with the audience when he saw the stage manager's signal. Dean was ready. Johnny glanced at the cue cards, found his mark, and turned to the camera with that familiar smile. "Our next guest," Johnny said, "needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway, because that's what they pay me for." The audience laughed. Johnny paused. "Let it settle. He's one of the great entertainers of our time. Singer, actor, and the only man I know who can make falling down look dignified. Please welcome Dean Martin." The band kicked in. Everybody loves somebody. And the curtain opened. Dean walked out, and Johnny knew immediately that something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. Dean was smiling. He waved to the audience. He moved across the stage with that same easy grace he always had. But Johnny had been reading people on live television for 12 years. He could see the micro-expressions, the tiny hesitations that most viewers would never catch. And in that moment, as Dean crossed from the curtain to the guest chair, Johnny saw something he'd never seen before. Dean Martin was not performing. He was just there. They shook hands. Dean sat down. The applause continued for another 15 seconds, long enough for Johnny to make a quick decision about how to play this. He could go with the standard opening, the drinking jokes, the Rat Pack stories, or he could follow his instinct and go somewhere else. Johnny chose instinct. "Dean," he said, once the applause died down, "good to see you." "Good to be here, Pally." The voice was right, the cadence was right, but there was something missing underneath it. Johnny couldn't quite name it, but he felt it. "You look tired," Johnny said. It was a risk. You didn't usually tell a guest they looked tired on national television, but Johnny had learned that sometimes the most honest thing you could say was the thing that broke the script. Dean looked at him. For just a second, the performance dropped completely. "Yeah," Dean said quietly. "I am." The audience didn't laugh. They didn't know if they were supposed to. Johnny didn't give them a cue. He just sat there, looking at Dean, waiting. "My boy's leaving tomorrow," Dean said. Johnny blinked. This wasn't in the pre-interview. This wasn't something they'd discussed in the green room. This was real. Leaving? Johnny asked carefully. Army, Dean said. Dean Paul, he enlisted, leaves for basic training in the morning. The studio was quiet. You could hear the hum of the stage lights, the distant rustle of the audience shifting in their seats. Johnny felt the weight of the moment settling over the room. This was live television, 15 million people watching, and Dean Martin, who never broke character, who never let anyone see behind the mask, was sitting here in front of all of them, talking about his son. How old is he? Johnny asked. 22. Johnny nodded slowly. He thought about his own sons, Chris, Corey, Rick. He thought about what it would feel like to watch one of them walk away, not knowing when they'd come back, or if they'd come back. That's a hard thing, Johnny said. Dean looked down at his hands. Yeah. The silence stretched about 3 seconds, 5. In television time, that was an eternity. The director in the booth was probably losing his mind, signaling for a commercial break, for someone to do something. But Johnny didn't move. He just sat there, letting Dean have the space. Finally, Dean looked up. He tried to smile. I told him he was crazy, Dean said. Told him he could do anything. Didn't have to go marching around some base in Carolina. But you know, kids, they don't listen. No, Johnny said. They don't. He wants to fly, Dean continued. His voice was softer now, like he was talking to himself as much as to Johnny. Jets. He's been obsessed with jets since he was 8 years old. I took him to an air show once, and that was it. He didn't want to sing, didn't want to act, just wanted to fly. Johnny watched him. The cameras were still rolling, but it felt like the two of them were alone in the room. That's a good dream, Johnny said. Yeah. Dean's voice caught slightly. Just slightly. It is. The audience was completely silent now. This wasn't what they'd come for. They'd come for the jokes, the stories, the easy laughter. But what they were getting was something else entirely, something raw. Johnny made another decision. He could steer this back to safe territory, ask about Dean's new album, make a joke about the Rat Pack, get the show back on track, or he could stay here, in this uncomfortable, honest place. He stayed. Are you scared? Johnny asked. It was the kind of question you weren't supposed to ask on The Tonight Show. Too personal, too real, but Johnny asked it anyway. Dean looked at him for a long time. Yeah, he said finally. I'm terrified. The word hung in the air. Terrified. Dean Martin, the king of cool, the man who made everything look effortless, was terrified. We had breakfast this morning, Dean said. Just the two of us. He's excited, you know? Got that look in his eyes like he's about to do something important. And I'm sitting there trying to eat my eggs, trying to be the supportive dad, but all I can think is... He trailed off. What? Johnny prompted gently. All I can think is I'm losing him. Johnny felt something twist in his chest. He knew that feeling. Every father knew that feeling. The moment when you realize your child is no longer yours to protect. Not losing, Johnny said quietly. Letting go. Dean nodded. Yeah, same thing though. Feels the same. Another silence. The director had definitely given up on the commercial break by now. This was the show. This was what was happening. Did you tell him? Johnny asked. Tell him what? That you're scared. Dean shook his head. No, you can't put that on them. They're already carrying enough. Johnny understood. That was the thing about being a father, especially a father of that generation. You didn't share your fears. You didn't burden your children with your own weakness. You smiled, you supported, you sent them off into the world, and you kept whatever terror you felt locked somewhere deep inside. So you came here instead, Johnny said. Dean looked at him surprised. Then he laughed. A real laugh, not the performer's laugh, short and bitter and honest. Yeah, he said. Guess I did. Why? Dean thought about it. Because you'll forget. America will forget. Tomorrow morning, Dean Paul gets on a bus and my life changes forever. But tomorrow night, you'll have some other guests sitting in this chair, and this'll just be another show. And maybe that's good. Maybe I need to put this somewhere that won't last. Johnny felt the weight of that. The strange intimacy of live television. You could say something to 15 million people, and somehow it felt more private than saying it to one. I won't forget, Johnny said. Dean looked at him. Really looked at him. No, he said softly. I don't think you will. They sat there for a moment, Two men in expensive suits, under bright lights, surrounded by cameras and audiences and the machinery of entertainment. But in that moment, none of that mattered. "You raised a good kid?" Johnny said. "That counts for something." "You think?" "I know." Dean nodded slowly. "He's better than me, braver, always has been." "That's not a bad thing to leave behind," Johnny said. "No." Dean's voice was barely above a whisper. "No, it's not." The stage manager was signaling frantically now. They were running long, way too long, but Johnny ignored him. "You want to talk about something else?" Johnny asked. "We can talk about the album, the shows in Vegas, whatever you want." Dean considered it. Then he shook his head. "No," he said. "This is enough. This is what I needed." Johnny nodded. He understood. "All right," Johnny said. He turned to the camera. "We're going to take a break. When we come back." He stopped. He didn't know what to say. The usual lines felt wrong. "When we come back," Dean said, saving him, "I'll tell you about the time Frank locked Sammy in a closet in Miami." The audience laughed, grateful, probably, to be released from the tension. The spell broke. The machinery of television started moving again. But as they cut to commercial, as the band played and the lights adjusted, Johnny caught Dean's eye. Dean gave him a small nod. A thank you, maybe, or an acknowledgement. Something passed between them that couldn't be put into words. When they came back from commercial, Dean told the Frank Sinatra story. It was funny. The audience loved it. They did another 6 minutes, easy, professional, exactly what people expected from Dean Martin on The Tonight Show. And when Dean's segment ended, he stood up, shook Johnny's hand, waved to the audience, and walked off stage with that same easy grace he'd had for 30 years. But Johnny knew. And maybe some of the viewers knew too, the ones who were really paying attention. That night, for just a few minutes, Dean Martin had stopped performing. He'd stopped being the character everyone expected him to be. He'd just been a father, scared for his son. The show continued. Johnny introduced the next guest, some actress promoting a movie he couldn't remember now. He laughed at her stories, asked the right questions, hit all his marks. By the time the show ended at 1 a.m., most of the audience had probably forgotten about Dean's segment entirely. But Johnny didn't forget. He went back to his dressing room after the show, loosened his tie, poured himself a drink. It was his ritual, decompress for an hour before heading home, go over the highlights and mistakes, prepare for tomorrow. But that night, he just sat there, thinking about Dean Martin's face when he said the word terrified. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," Johnny said. It was Ed McMahon. His jacket was off, his tie undone. He looked tired. It had been a long day, a long show. "Hell of a night," Ed said. "Yeah." "You okay?" Johnny looked up at him. Ed had been with him since the beginning. 12 years, over 3,000 shows. He knew Johnny better than almost anyone. "Did we do the right thing?" Johnny asked. "Letting that play out like that?" Ed sat down. "What else were you going to do? I could have steered him away from it, made a joke, changed the subject. That's what I'm supposed to do." "Maybe," Ed said. "But sometimes people need to say things, and sometimes we need to let them." Johnny thought about that. 15 million people watching. Yeah. That's a lot of witnesses. Or a lot of company, Ed said quietly. Johnny looked at him, surprised. "Think about it," Ed continued. "How many fathers out there watching tonight just had the same conversation with their own sons? How many of them are scared too? Maybe Dean gave them permission to feel that." Johnny hadn't thought of it that way. He'd been so focused on whether they'd crossed some line, violated some unspoken rule of television, that he hadn't considered what it might have meant to the people watching. "You think he's okay?" Johnny asked. Ed shrugged. "I think he's a father who's losing sleep over his kid, same as the rest of us." "Yeah." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the studio was emptying out, the crew packing up equipment, the audience filing into the parking lot, another show complete. "You ever think about what we do here?" Johnny asked suddenly. "What do you mean?" "This," Johnny gestured vaguely at the walls. "The show. All of it. Most nights it's just noise, you know? Jokes and celebrities, and fill the time until people fall asleep. But tonight was different," Ed finished. "Yeah." Ed stood up, clapped Johnny on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Johnny. Long day tomorrow." "Always is." Ed left. Johnny sat there for another 20 minutes, nursing his drink, thinking about Dean Martin and Sons and the things people never say out loud. Finally, he turned off the lights and went home. The next morning, Dean Paul Martin boarded a bus for basic training. Dean didn't go with him. He'd said his goodbyes the night before, over breakfast, just the two of them. He watched from the window of his house in Beverly Hills as the sun came up, and he thought about jets and air shows and 8-year-old boys with impossible dreams. And somewhere in America, 15 million people woke up and went about their lives, most of them having already forgotten the strange, quiet moment they'd witnessed on The Tonight Show the night before. But some of them remembered. Some of them thought about their own sons, their own daughters, the people they loved who were walking away into uncertain futures. Some of them felt a little less alone in their fear. That was the thing about television, Johnny would think later. Most of it disappeared the moment it aired, but sometimes, not often, but sometimes, you caught something real, something true. And that stayed. February 13th, 1974. The Tonight Show resumed its normal rhythm. Johnny told jokes, Ed laughed, the guests came and went. America watched and laughed and forgot. But in his dressing room, Johnny kept a photograph that a crew member had taken during Dean's segment. It wasn't a good photograph, slightly out of focus, the lighting was off. But it captured the moment when Dean had stopped performing, when his face had been just a father's face, unguarded and afraid. Johnny never showed it to anyone. He just kept it in his desk drawer, underneath the cue cards and the scheduling sheets. A reminder that beneath all the performance, all the machinery of entertainment, there were real people with real fears. And sometimes, if you listened carefully enough, you could hear them. Dean Paul Martin did become a pilot. He flew F-4 Phantom jets for the California Air National Guard. He was good at it. Excellent, actually. Everything his father had feared and everything he'd hoped for. On March 21st, 1987, 13 years after that night on The Tonight Show, Dean Paul's F-4 Phantom disappeared in a storm over the San Bernardino Mountains. He was declared dead at age 35. Dean Martin never fully recovered. He continued to perform for a while, but something had broken in him. The easy smile became harder to maintain. The jokes felt heavier. In 1988, he gave his last performance in Las Vegas. He died 7 years later, on Christmas Day, 1995. Johnny Carson learned about Dean Paul's death the same way everyone else did, from a news bulletin. He was in his office at NBC, preparing for that night's show. Someone turned on the television, and there it was. Breaking news. A military jet down, pilot identified as Dean Paul Martin, son of Dean Martin. Johnny's first thought was of that night in 1974. Dean sitting in the guest chair saying, "I'm terrified." The quiet way he'd talked about breakfast with his son, about letting go, about fear. Johnny had Dean Martin on the show 3 more times after that night. Each time they talked about the usual things, movies, music, Vegas. They never mentioned Dean Paul again. Never talked about jets or fear or fathers and sons. It was as if that one night had been a dream, a brief crack in the performance that had sealed itself back up. But now, sitting in his office with the news playing on the television, Johnny wondered if Dean had been living with this fear for 13 years. If every time Dean Paul climbed into a cockpit, Dean had held his breath. If every time the phone rang late at night, Dean had expected it to be this call. Johnny did the show that night. He made jokes. The audience laughed. But he kept thinking about Dean, alone somewhere, receiving the news that the thing he'd been terrified of had finally happened. 3 days later, Johnny sent a letter. Not a phone call, Dean wouldn't have answered. Not flowers, too public, just a short handwritten note on plain paper. "I remember that night," Johnny wrote. "I remember what you said. I'm sorry." He didn't know if Dean ever received it. They never spoke about it. The Tonight Show continued for another 18 years after Dean Paul's death. Johnny interviewed thousands more guests, told hundreds of thousands more jokes. He became an institution, a fixture of American life, the man who said good night to the country. But he never forgot that night with Dean Martin. Sometimes, late at night after a show, when the studio was empty and the crew had gone home, Johnny would think about it, about the way Dean had looked when he'd stopped performing, about the vulnerability in his voice when he'd said, "I'm terrified." about the strange intimacy of sharing that fear with 15 million strangers. Television was supposed to be an escape, entertainment, a way to forget about the world for a while. But that night, for just a few minutes, it had been something else. A confessional. A shared space where a father could admit his fear and maybe, just maybe, feel a little less alone in it. Johnny retired from The Tonight Show in 1992. His last show aired on May 22nd, watched by 50 million people. He'd spent 30 years in that studio, under those lights, performing for America. And in all that time, he'd never had another moment quite like the one he'd had with Dean Martin. In his final monologue, Johnny talked about a lot of things. He thanked his staff, his guests, his audience. He made jokes about retirement, about golf, about finally getting enough sleep. But he didn't mention Dean Martin. Didn't talk about that night in 1974, or the lesson he'd learned about when to follow the script and when to let it go. Some things didn't need to be said out loud. After Johnny retired, he disappeared from public life almost completely. He didn't do interviews, didn't make appearances, didn't chase the spotlight. He'd spent 30 years being Johnny Carson, and now he just wanted to be John. He lived quietly in Malibu, read books, watched the ocean, played tennis. And sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he thought about all the nights, all the guests, all the moments that had happened in that studio. Most of them blurred together. But some stood out. Dean Martin sitting in the guest chair, no longer performing. I'm terrified. That was the moment Johnny understood something fundamental about his job. It wasn't really about the jokes or the celebrities or the ratings. It was about giving people a space to be human, even if just for a few minutes, even if 15 million people were watching, especially if 15 million people were watching. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. The news covered it extensively. Tributes poured in, clips played on every network. America mourned the man who had said goodnight to them for 3 decades. Among Johnny's personal effects, his family found a folder of photographs and mementos from The Tonight Show. Most of it was what you'd expect, pictures with presidents, famous guests, historic moments. But there was one photograph that puzzled them. It was blurry, poorly lit, and didn't seem particularly significant. Just Dean Martin sitting in the guest chair, looking tired. On the back, in Johnny's handwriting, was a date, February 12, 1974. And below that, a single line, the night we stopped performing. They didn't understand it. Why would Johnny have kept this particular photograph? This particular moment? There were thousands of other nights, other guests, other moments that seemed more important. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the moments that matter most aren't the ones that look important. They're the quiet ones, the honest ones, the ones where 2 people stop performing and just are. That night in 1974, for just a few minutes, Dean Martin had let the mask slip, and Johnny had given him the space to do it. No jokes to diffuse the tension, no redirect to safer territory. Just 2 men, sitting under bright lights, talking about fear and suns and the things we carry. 15 million people watched, and most of them forgot, but some of them remembered. And maybe that was enough.